Everyone has heard of Pickett's charge. The doomed assault at Gettysburg, the long walk across open ground into the waiting guns, has become the single most famous act of feudal courage in all of American history. It is taught in every school, painted in galleries, mourned forever as the high water mark of the Confederacy. But here is the thing that almost no one will ever tell you. A year and a half later, in the cold of a Tennessee autumn, a Confederate general ordered a charge that was larger than Pickett's, more hopeless than Pickett's, and far more destructive than Pickett's ever was. He sent his men across nearly 2 miles of open field, in broad daylight against an enemy dug deep into prepared earthworks, with almost no artillery to cover them. And by the time the sun went down that day, 6 of his own generals lay dead or dying. This is the Battle of Franklin, the charge that history quietly forgot, and the man who ordered it was named John Bell Hood. The story of why he did it is not the simple story of a fool making a mistake. It is something much darker and far more human, a story about humiliation and rage, and a broken man who, on one terrible afternoon, may have sent the finest soldiers in his army to their deaths in part to punish them. To understand how a thing like that could happen, you first have to understand the man, and then you have to understand the night before. John Bell Hood was, by the winter of 1864, one of the most physically shattered men ever to lead an army into the field. He had begun the war as a fighter of legendary aggression, the commander of the famous Texas Brigade, a man who led from the very front and asked nothing of his soldiers that he was not willing to absorb himself. At Gettysburg, a shell fragment tore through his left arm and left it permanently crippled, hanging all but useless at his side for the rest of his life. A few months later, at the Battle of Chickamauga, a bullet shattered his right leg so badly that the surgeons amputated it high at the thigh. He came within a few hours of dying on the table. But he survived, and he had himself fitted with a cork leg and strapped upright into his saddle because he could no longer mount or dismount a horse without the help of other men. This was the body that rode into Tennessee that winter, a man living in constant pain, missing a leg, unable to use one arm, held upright on his horse by leather straps. There is a popular story that he dulled all that pain with laudanum, with opium, and that the drug clouded his judgment. But the honest truth is that historians genuinely dispute this, and there is no firm proof of it at all. So set it aside as a possibility, not a fact, and look instead at the thing that is certain. What is certain is that Hood had been promoted far, far beyond the kind of command he was actually good at. As a brigade and division commander, his reckless aggression had been a weapon. He charged, he broke things, he won, and his men loved him for it. But an army is not a brigade. An army has to be maneuvered, supplied, husbanded, and preserved. And the very instinct that made Hood magnificent at the head of a few thousand men made him genuinely dangerous in command of 40,000. He had one answer to almost every problem he ever faced, and that answer was to attack head-on, no matter the cost. By the time he reached Tennessee, that instinct had stopped being a strength. It had curdled into something closer to a compulsion, and it was about to collide with the one night that would set the whole of it on fire. And before we get to that night, let me be direct with you for a moment, because this is exactly the kind of story this channel was built to tell. The battles you were handed in school are the same famous handful, repeated over and over. The ones that would actually break your heart, the ones that carry the real weight of what that war was, were quietly left out of the story, and Franklin is the very worst of those omissions. If you want the history nobody ever bothered to give you, the version with the real names and the real cost and the real truth, then stop right here and subscribe. That is the entire reason this place exists. Now, the night that lit the fuse. On the 29th of November, 1864, the day before Franklin, John Bell Hood was handed one of the great opportunities of the entire war in the West, and he stood and watched it walk away from him in the dark. The situation was this. A Union army under General John Schofield was strung out and badly exposed on the road north, hurrying to reach the safety of Nashville before Hood's larger force could catch and destroy it. If Hood could simply get across that road and block it, he could trap Schofield's whole army in the open and annihilate it. And for one golden afternoon, it looked as though he would do exactly that. Hood maneuvered his army to a small town called Spring Hill, sitting directly alongside the very road the Union column had to use. His men were in position. The trap was set and waiting. All that remained was to reach out and close it. And then, through one of the most baffling command breakdowns of the entire war, nothing happened. Orders were given and misunderstood, or given and somehow never carried out at all. Generals sat waiting for instructions that never came, or that came far too late to matter. Night fell, and the Confederate army lay down to sleep beside its campfires, with the road still wide open in front of it. And in the darkness, the entire Union army got up and marched. Schofield's men moved north along that road all night long, passing so close to the sleeping Confederate camps that some of the rebels woke and actually saw them, heard the rumble of the wagon wheels and the tramp of thousands of feet going by in the dark. A few soldiers even raised the alarm and sent word back up the chain of command that the enemy was escaping right under their noses. And somehow, that warning died somewhere out in the night, lost in the confusion and the exhaustion of a broken command before it ever reached anyone willing to act on it. By the time the sun came up, the trap was empty. Schofield was gone, marching hard for Franklin, and the great chance was simply lost. When Hood awoke on the morning of the 30th and finally understood what had happened in the night, he was, by every account that survives, beside himself. And this was not the cold disappointment of a commander calmly reviewing a missed opportunity. It was fury, raw and personal and burning. He was humiliated. He had held the enemy in the palm of his hand and let him slip away in the dark. And in Hood's mind, the fault was not his own and never could be. It was his generals. It was his men. He became utterly convinced that the army had grown soft, that his soldiers had lost their nerve somewhere along the long retreat from Atlanta, that they had let the enemy escape out of pure timidity and a failure of will to close and fight. Hold on to that conviction, that bitter, burning, absolute certainty that his own army had betrayed him in the night, because a few hours later, it was going to decide the fate of 6,000 men. Hood caught up with Schofield's army at the town of Franklin, where the Union force had halted to cross a river, and where, while it waited its turn at the crossing, it had thrown up a formidable line of earthworks. The Federals were dug in, well protected, and waiting. Between Hood's army and that line lay nearly 2 miles of open, gently rising farmland, with almost no cover of any kind anywhere upon it. Any assault across that ground would have to be made entirely in the open, in the full light of late afternoon, straight into the muzzles of entrenched infantry and artillery. Every experienced officer who looked out across that field understood instantly what an attack over it would mean. This was not some subtle, tactical puzzle with a hidden solution. It was, to anyone who had survived the previous 3 years of this war, obviously and almost unspeakably suicidal. The most respected of all of them, Patrick Cleburne, a division commander so gifted that men called him the Stonewall of the West, looked at what Hood was ordering and understood exactly what it was. The accounts of what Cleburne said that afternoon vary from teller to teller, but the shape of them is always the same. He knew the order was very likely a death sentence, and he resolved to carry it out anyway, remarking, by several accounts, that if they were to die, then they would die like men. And this is the very heart of the question that the whole story turns on. Hood did not order this charge because he had spotted some opening that everyone else had missed. He ordered it against the plain and visible judgment of his best and most experienced subordinates, across ground that screamed its own warning to anyone with eyes, with his army's blood still hot from the humiliation of the night before. The most troubling reading of Franklin, the one that has haunted it ever since, is that Spring Hill is the real reason for it. That Hood, enraged at an army he had convinced himself had refused to fight in the dark, was now going to force it to fight in the daylight, in the open, in the worst possible place on earth to do it, as much to prove a savage point and to punish his men as to actually win anything at all. He had decided that his soldiers needed to be taught how to attack, and he was about to teach them the lesson at a price that would gut the Army of Tennessee for good. The assault went forward in the late afternoon of November the 30th. Somewhere around 20,000 Confederate soldiers stepped off into that open field and began the long walk toward the Union works. That was more men than Pickett had ever sent up the slope at Gettysburg, across more open ground, into a stronger and better prepared line. And for a few astonishing minutes, the sheer weight and courage of the thing actually carried part of the assault all the way into the Union trenches. The fighting at the center, around a farmhouse known as the Carter House, dissolved into some of the most savage hand-to-hand combat of the entire war, men killing one another with bayonets and clubbed rifles in the failing light across a few feet of torn and bloody ground. Inside the Carter House itself, the family that owned it huddled together in the cellar through the long night while the battle raged across their own front yard and against the very walls above their heads. And there, one of the cruelest accidents of the entire war quietly played out. A young Confederate officer named Todd Carter, a son of that very house, who had not seen his home in years of soldiering, was mortally wounded in the fighting within sight of the door he had grown up walking through. They carried him inside, and he died in the rooms of his own childhood. Of everything that Franklin was, there is no single image that lands harder than that one. But raw courage cannot hold open ground against prepared works for long, and the price of those few minutes was almost beyond counting. In the space of a single afternoon, and the dark evening that followed it, Hood's army suffered around 6,000 casualties. And among the dead and the dying lay something the Confederacy could never, ever replace: its leadership. 6 Confederate generals were killed or mortally wounded at Franklin in those few hours. Say their names slowly, because the army never recovered from the loss of them. Patrick Cleburne, the Stonewall of the West, the finest of them all, killed near the very line he had told his own men they would die trying to reach. John Adams, killed leading his men forward on horseback, his body found at the very edge of the Union works. States' Rights Gist, dead. Hiram Granbury, dead, cut down at the head of his Texans. Otho Strahl, killed down in the ditch in front of the works, passing loaded rifles up to his men until a bullet finally found him. And John Carter, mortally wounded, who would linger on in agony for nearly 2 weeks before he died. 6 men who knew their soldiers by name, who held the army together at the exact level where battles are truly won and lost, all of them gone in a single afternoon. The brain and the spine of the Army of Tennessee, broken in one charge that its own best officers had known was hopeless before the first man ever stepped off. It was not a defeat, it was a decapitation. And the most chilling part of the whole thing is that it changed nothing. Hood could not have changed without spilling a single drop of that blood. Schofield, having bled Hood's army white, simply withdrew his own force across the river that very night and continued his march to Nashville, exactly as he had been doing all along. The 2 miles of open ground, the 6,000 men, the 6 dead generals, the shattered cotton gin, and the bodies stacked against the works, all of it bought the Confederacy nothing whatsoever. And here is where the tragedy of John Bell Hood becomes almost unbearable to follow to its end. Because after Franklin, after gutting his own army and burying the men who had led it, Hood did not stop. He did not pull back to nurse his wounds and preserve what little remained. He gathered up the bleeding, shrunken remnant of the Army of Tennessee, and he marched it north, straight after Schofield, all the way to the gates of Nashville. Waiting for him, there was a Union army under the command of a methodical, immovable Virginian named George Thomas. And what Thomas did to the ghost of Hood's army 2 weeks later was not a battle either. It was the end. In 2 days of fighting outside Nashville, Thomas shattered the Army of Tennessee so completely and so finally that it effectively ceased to exist for the remainder of the war. The great Western Army of the Confederacy, the army Hood had inherited whole and then flung against the works at Franklin, simply came apart and streamed south in broken pieces through the bitter December cold. And only then, with his army destroyed not once but twice over, did John Bell Hood at last resign his command. He had been handed one of the 2 great armies of the Confederacy, and in a matter of a few short weeks, he had used it entirely up. So what, in the end, do we call what Hood did at Franklin? It is tempting to reach for an easy word and be done with it. Incompetence, madness, but neither one of them quite holds the whole of the truth. He was not a stupid man, and he was not an insane one. He was a brave and broken man, raised far too high, living in too much pain, carrying far too much rage from a humiliation the night before, who made a decision that any clear-eyed observer on that field could see was a catastrophe, and made it anyway, and then refused to admit what it had cost him until the cost was absolute and total. The men who walked across that open field deserved a far better general than the one who sent them into it. Most of them never came back to say so. And the man who gave the order spent the rest of his own short life insisting that the fault had been theirs, and never once, not for a single moment, his own. Why he could never bring himself to see it, why he marched the survivors on to Nashville to be destroyed rather than face what Franklin had already told him in the plainest possible terms, takes you down into one of the most haunted and self-deceiving minds the entire war ever produced. And that is a story all its own.